Good evening, everybody. Welcome to St. Patrick's Seminary and University. On behalf of Archbishop Corteleone, the Archbishop of San Francisco, and all the faculty, students, and staff at the seminary, we're very glad to welcome you this evening for this lecture event. As we always do here at St. Patrick's, we begin with a prayer. If you'll join me in the name of the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, we turn and entrust all of our intentions to Our Lady as we pray. Remember, most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, Virgin of Virgins, our Mother. To thee do we cry, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good evening once again. My name is Father Mark Doherty. I'm the President Rector of St. Patrick's. We're very glad to welcome you this evening for this lecture event. I will go ahead and introduce General McMaster, who will then make his remarks. We'll have a period for questions and answers, and then at the conclusion of that segment, I invite all of you to join us over here in the refectory. The seminarians will point the way outside the doors to the left outside the carriage doors, over to the refectory for a reception. But please allow me, without further ado, to introduce our guest speaker. H.R. McMaster is the Fouad and Michelle Ahami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He is also the Bernard and Susan Liotto Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Upon graduation from the U.S. Military Academy in 1984, McMaster served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army for 34 years. He retired as a lieutenant general in June 2018 after serving as the 25th assistant to the U.S. President for National Security Affairs. From 2014 to 2017, McMaster designed the future Army as the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General, Futures of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. As Commanding General of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, he oversaw all training and education for the Army's infantry, armor, and cavalry forces. He has commanded organizations in wartime, including the Combined Joint Interagency Task Force, Shafayat in Kabul, Afghanistan, from 2010 to 2012, the 3rd Army Cavalry Regiment in Iraq from 2005 to 2006, and Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Operation Desert Storm from 1990 to 1991. McMaster also served overseas as advisor to the most senior commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. McMaster holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was an assistant professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy. He is author of the best-selling books Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies that Led to Vietnam. In August 2024, McMaster released his most recent book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. His many essays, articles, and book reviews on leadership, history, and the future of warfare have appeared in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, National Review, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. McMaster is also the host of Battlegrounds, Vital Perspectives on Today's Challenges, and is a regular on Goodfellows, both produced by the Hoover Institution. He is a distinguished university fellow at Arizona State University. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster.
Thank you so much. What a privilege it is to be here with everyone. And I just want to say thank you to the Archbishop Cordileone, Father Doherty, for the opportunity to be with you and for your gracious hospitality and especially your service to all of us and to humanity. And I want to thank everyone here who has answered the call to their vocation and tell you how much I admire your dedication to our church and to all humanity. And it's just such a wonderful privilege to be with all of you who have committed to serve, and humbling for my wife Katie and I to be with you. I've got one of my good friends here, Peter Robinson, and his wife Adita, who came from the Hoover Institution. We're your colleagues there. I recommend his video series called Uncommon Knowledge, especially the theological discussions he has, which are fantastic, by the way. But hey, what I thought might be appropriate to talk about with you are three stories of faith and providence. Three stories of faith and providence, not from my time in the White House, where I allude in the title of my latest book to metaphorical wars in Washington, but three tales from actual wars. And all of these, what all these stories have in common are elements of these stories, I think, that can only be explained by the presence of God in our lives. And there are many other stories across my career, but I didn't know I would not have enough time to cover all of them. So I thought maybe I would use three that are representative of how important it is to have faith, especially when one confronts the prospects of death in combat, and when one confronts evil that I've seen in various places in the world, but also have had the great gift of working alongside courageous and honorable young men and women in an effort and succeeding in seeing good triumph over that evil. So, I reflected on these experiences of war when I was writing my latest book about the metaphorical war in the Trump White House. And in the book, if anybody wants to pick it up, I do refer to my faith a few times, and especially the power of the serenity prayer, and to focus on the things you can control, right, where you can make a difference, and how that gave me great comfort. But my faith also, gave me tremendous strength when I confronted the evil associated with jihadist terrorists or those who were part of Saddam Hussein's brutal apparatus for repression over the Iraqi people. And I think that it's really important to understand, I think, for all Americans, that their servicemen and women are warriors, but they're also humanitarians. They're humanitarians because they have to confront evil in battle, but also they have to conduct themselves at a very high standard, an ethical standard in combat. And I believe that as you prepare soldiers and leaders for combat, it's very important to focus on the moral, the ethical and psychological dimension of war, and to prepare them for that. And I think it's important because obviously you want soldiers to be confident, right? And it's really the confidence in their ability to fight together as a team that gives them confidence, but it's also confidence in the righteousness of their cause, and confidence that the soldiers and the units that they're with will perform their duties consistent not only with the laws of war, but also consistent with a higher ethical code based on our Catholic faith and our Christian faith. Everything we're taught and everything we learn about just war and the ethical conduct of war, I believe, derives from our faith, and in particular the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think it's particularly important to include a spiritual dimension of preparation as you prepare soldiers for an activity that involves killing and the prospect of death. And I think to train and educate soldiers in a way that treats them, that they have to treat people, men and women, as an ends, even under the most difficult conditions of combat. And this is obviously consistent with the teaching of Jesus, but also consistent with other secular philosophers like Immanuel Kant. It's important then to imbue soldiers with that sense, to treat man and women as an end in themselves, but also to appeal to them to ensure that they uphold the highest ethical standards of conduct, even under the most arduous conditions, by also appealing to them from just a straight-up utilitarian perspective, more like a John Stuart Mill perspective. What I would often say to soldiers and talk to them about is that we have an ethos that holds us to a much higher standard than any other army in the world. But also, just from a practical experience in combat, if you treat civilian populations, if you treat innocents in war, non-combatants in war, with anything but respect and care, you're actually working for your enemies who use brutality to advance their objectives. And I think what many Americans really don't understand about our ethos, our warrior ethos, is that certainly it is what makes units effective. And what I'm talking about a warrior ethos is really a covenant between soldiers in an organization, but also a covenant between our military and those in whose name we fight and serve. And that ethos is based on principles that we all know are centered, are central to our faith. And those principles include honor, our sense of honor. Really what soldiers, I think, are motivated by oftentimes is a fear of letting one another down in terms of their standards of conduct. And they're more afraid of that than actually the enemy. But also courage, toughness, but also humaneness. And I think what's really important to understand about that warrior ethos is it is what makes soldiers effective by allowing them to overcome their instincts for self-preservation and to work to achieve an aim over which others are trying to kill them. But it's the warrior ethos that also makes war less inhumane. It's because soldiers expect ethical conduct from one another. It's also what allows soldiers who return from battle to know that they served and fought with honor. And I believe it is the best inoculation against post-traumatic stress and the negative effects associated with post-traumatic stress. Soldiers to know that they're involved in a righteous cause and that they have conducted themselves honorably under the most oftentimes horrifying, horrendous conditions of battle. So I wanted to tell you 3 stories about how I experienced faith in battle and how it deepened my faith and made me grateful to God and grateful for putting that ethical preparation and moral preparation for combat at the foundation of our preparation for war. So Katie and I were in Germany in 1989 when the wall came down. Actually, our cavalry troop was patrolling the east-west German border the day that East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the west. And so we went from one moment staring down East German border guards to the next moment seeing the gates open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans poured across that border. And they were bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine. There were hugs and tears of joy. And I remember a few months after that, Katie and I were in a silly argument about something I can't remember. She said, "You're just mad because you don't have an enemy anymore," you know. But thank you, Saddam Hussein. You know, he came through. You know, he came through. In August of 1990, he invaded Kuwait, and our unit was training. We were conducting some maneuver and live fire training. And I got all our troopers together that day that East Germany lifted. That day that Saddam invaded. And I said, "Hey, I just want to tell you, we have to make the most out of this training, because the next operations order I give you may be in the desert sands of Saudi Arabia," which sounded very melodramatic. But I really believed it. I believed we'd be activated and go, and we did. And during our preparation for fighting there, one of my sergeants, a really fantastic human being, have you ever seen the movie The Green Mile? You know, the protagonist, the unjustly incarcerated, very large African-American guy? Well, Dean Turan made that guy look small, okay? I always marveled about how he could fit into a Bradley fighting vehicle. Like he was like just wedged in there, you know? And I brought him into my office and I said, "Hey, Sergeant Turan, you're a very good sergeant, but I don't think you're up to the task to be a platoon sergeant." So he had been elevated to the next level. He wasn't quite ready for that. And I was going to recruit somebody to take his job. And I wanted to give him a vote on what happened after that. I said, "Hey, listen, Dean, you could stay in the troop if you'd like, and be a squad leader, one level down, or I can transfer you to another troop and you can start over again. And he said, okay, sir, well, I'd like to pray about that for a while. He's a very religious, devout person from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And I was kind of skeptical about it, I have to tell you. I thought, I mean, can't you just tell me, like, right now? I mean, you make it a quick prayer. But anyway, so he came, he came back the next day. And this is before, we were alerted to go to war or anything. And he said, I prayed about it, and three things came to me. He said, the first thing is that I should stay in the troop. The second thing is that we're going to go to war, and you will make the right decision at the right time, and as a result, we will all come back alive. And then he said, the third thing that came to me, and he quoted the verse from the Bible, he will make seeing eyes blind and blind eyes see. So just think about that, keep that in the back of your mind for a second. We deployed to the desert in November of 1990, as part of Operation Desert Shield, and we're preparing for the attack into Iraq, which we knew was going to come at some point. It actually came in February of 1991, and our cavalry troop led the advance into Iraq on the so-called left hook. Now, prior to us going into Iraq, I made sure that soldiers from every denomination had access to a religious service consistent with their beliefs. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish were the three main denominations faced in our cavalry troop. And I went to all of them, because I think, hey, if you're going to war, it's important to assure your soldiers, hey, your commander's not a heathen. You know what I mean? Somebody might be looking out for you out there. But then also just to get a sense, for what our soldiers were thinking. Oftentimes these were at night, it's pitch black in the desert, the beautiful, like 360 degrees, stars and so forth in a really dark desert. And some soldiers would often come up, almost always after a religious service or mass. And after mass, one of my soldiers came up to me and he said, I'm a religious person. He said, you've come to mass every time, and he said, I feel like I don't know if I should take somebody's life, and he was very conflicted about that he may have to do that. And so I fell back, on Thomas Aquinas, and I talked to him about just war theory, in the middle of the desert, and that what makes a war just is that it's a sovereign authority, but it has to be a just cause. And I talked about the brutality of Saddam Hussein that he had visited on the Kuwaiti people, and I talked about the next sort of criteria for jus ad bellum, which is morally right intentions, and talked to him about our right intentions in kicking out this predatory army that had abused and raped and murdered Kuwaitis and looted the country, and return it to the Kuwaitis. And I think that gave him some comfort. We actually talked about it later after the war, and I might get to that if we have time about it. But what I'd like to do is relate to you just a quick story of the battle that we had on February 26th of 1991. It's known as the Battle of 73 Easting. And in this battle, we were moving from west to east in a sandstorm. It had poured rain all night, and I was like soaking wet. I thought, man, isn't this supposed to be a desert? I mean, you have these chemical suits on. It's all, it's not super comfortable. And we were moving to the east in a halting manner. We knew that the Republican Guard defenses were there, but we didn't know exactly where they were. And we had maps, but we didn't have really detailed maps. We were using them like a plotting board. It was a featureless desert, completely featureless, like a tabletop. So we were navigating by dead reckoning with a compass. We would run my loader out from the tank, and then hold our gun on stabilized, and then drive and check the odometer to see where we were. We had these new things called a GPS, but they only worked for like 4 hours a day. Every other hour we called it GPS sad time. We entered it. But we were paralleling a road, and we didn't realize we were paralleling a road. And the Iraqis had organized their defense around that road. They thought, okay, these guys, they're moving through a featureless desert. For us to move through a featureless desert, we have to kind of use landmarks like this road and so forth. So the Iraqi brigade commander who had graduated from the Infantry Officer Advanced Course at Fort Benning, Georgia, the post I later commanded. He paid attention when he was there. And he had organized his defense by strong pointing along that road. And then he had organized that defense on an imperceptible ridge line on the back side of it. So this ridge line ran north to south. We're going west to east. And on the back side of that ridge, he had organized what are called kill sacks on the backside, engagement areas where as we came over, they would equalize their weapons capabilities with ours, and they would be able to destroy us piecemeal as we came over top of that ridge. And of course, the sandstorm was blowing hard. We had very limited visibility. All of our aircraft were grounded as a result. And we got the word, hey, you get to move to the 6-7 north-south grid, 6-7 easting, north-south grid line on the map. And as we approached the 6-7, we came under fire on our right flank, 2 of our Bradley fighting vehicles. We returned fire, and I brought the 9 tanks up online and delivered a 9-tank volley into that strong point of defense, after which we got permission to move 3 more kilometers to the east. And we knew we were approaching the Republican Guard. We had captured a couple of their vehicles. We had destroyed some of their scouts earlier in the day, and we had just captured a couple of their scouts from an outpost. So at that point, though, and I think back to what Soren Turan told me, I just had a feeling. Even though everything looked flat in front of me, I felt like we were about to get into a major fight. Almost as if somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I cannot completely reconstruct my decision-making. And I just said, hey, battle stations, this is Black 6. Go to tanks lead, follow my move. Green and white, follow my move. What that meant is that our more vulnerable scout vehicles, Bradleys, who were in front of me, is that I would maneuver a 9-tank wedge with my tank at the apex of that wedge through those Bradleys and assume the lead of our attack to the east. So our most protected platforms, Abrams tanks, were in the front. And so as we progressed through the sandstorm, our scouts picked up a hot spot. They destroyed an enemy tank with a tow missile, and the Bradleys began to open fire to recon by fire, which held back the other 8 tanks for what for me seemed a considerable amount of time. It wasn't really that long, but enough time for me to crest that rise and to see the enemy forces on the back side of it. As I crested the rise, I remember, and you know, there are tricks of memory and so forth, but I remember pretty clearly, it was as if the entire sandstorm disappeared. I could see everything completely clearly, including like every enemy vehicle, about 40 enemy tanks, 8 were in the first group that we encountered, hundreds of infantry in trench lines, and subsequent defensive positions behind that. Our tank destroyed 3 of the enemy T-72s in 10 seconds or so, and the 2 enemy tanks opened up on my tank. But my tanks, as they came over, the other 8 tanks, saw those 2 T-72s fire at me and said it was as if the rounds had been deflected into the ground. We continued our assault through those tanks. They had created a curtain of smoke and fire that divided those other tanks from ours, and when we penetrated that smoke screen, essentially, we saw the rest of the enemy, and we began to fire at them. My executive officer called me and said, "Hey, you're not going to hear this, but you know you're at the limit of advance, and we're at the 7-0 easting." And to which I responded, "Hey, tell them I'm sorry. We can't stop. We're in contact. We had delivered a very devastating blow to the enemy." And it's like in boxing, if you land a jab, you're not going to hold back on your right, And so we continued the attack for another 4 kilometers until essentially there was nothing left to shoot. We got on top of the final ridge line, and as we got on top of that ridge line, the enemy's reserve of 18 T-72 tanks had started their engines and were about to deploy against us in a counterattack. But because we had continued the assault, we were able to prevent them from doing that. But the rest of the story I want to tell you is that as immediately after we consolidated there, we began to take prisoners and evaluate and treat enemy wounded. We brought our psychological operations team forward and made a surrender appeal to the Iraqi forces that were in front of us. A group of 18 came forward first, and then hundreds came forward. Our soldiers treated them with tremendous respect, and they couldn't believe it. Some of them had run away so fast from their bunkers that they had no boots. Our soldiers gave them extra boots. They gave them food. They gave them water. Many of them had looted Rolex watches. They had wallets full of cash. Our soldiers searched them and gave them back to them. They couldn't believe it, that we weren't taking anything from them. About half of them were crying because they had been told that American soldiers would execute them, which is one of the reasons they fought so resolutely during this fight. The main battle lasted about 23 minutes. We had many other engagements after that, but we were able to defeat the enemy soundly and suffered no casualties. The next day, we helped Iraqis gather their dead as they conducted religious services and so forth. And then I also gathered our leaders the next day because I thought, hey, we might be in another fight. Something else might be around the corner for us to have an after-action review. And that's when Dean Turan came up and put his arm around me, and he said, I'm not going to tell you what I told you in Bamberg, Germany, which is where we're stationed. I'd like you to tell me. And of course, I just got a wave of goosebumps and so forth. But I wanted to share that story about how faith played a role, and providence, I believe, played a role in the fact that we all came out of that battle unscathed against really very lopsided odds against us. That same soldier who had asked me, hey, I'm very concerned about having to take a life. About a week later, we moved up into South Baghdad, outside of a town called An-Naziriyah, the closest unit to Baghdad at the end of the war, when we occupied southern Iraq. We occupied an area that included Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham's birthplace, which was fantastic for bringing our soldiers through and to have mass, at the base of the ziggurat out there and so forth. But there we saw Saddam's brutality as they came back into the area that we did not control, where they were conducting mass executions in the city just beyond our reach, beyond the demarcation line that separated our forces. And that's when the soldier who had concerns about having to take a life in combat came up to me and said, I'm glad that we did what we did. And were able to at least prevent Saddam from continuing to victimize the people in Kuwait. So that's one story. Years later, I had the opportunity to command a cavalry regiment. That cavalry troop that I was talking about is a cavalry troop of about 136 troopers. Later, I commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, a regiment of about 5,500 troopers, as we went into Iraq in 2004 with a mission of operating initially in South Baghdad. But in the middle of our operations in South Baghdad, as soon as we started those operations, we got a change of mission to move to western Nineveh province, west of Mosul, Iraq. It was an area that had been taken over by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I think one of the most brutal terrorist organizations in history, who had completely subjugated the population around the city and in the city of Tel Afar, a city of about 250,000 people that became the training base, kind of the Quantico for the Marines or the Fort Benning for the Army of the terrorist organization. It's here where they brought young, vulnerable people in and continued to dehumanize and brainwash them so they could be suicide bombers. They also had very advanced courses in that city. They had a sniping school, they had a roadside bomb school. They actually had a course in kidnapping and murder. We found all of their syllabi, for their courses as we went into that city. They had mortar classes, first aid classes, everything that you would consider kind of a advanced military training or terrorist training in this case. But what was striking about this to me, about this terrorist organization is how the first thing they did is they took over the mosques. They ran out the legitimate imams and they replaced them with so-called imams who were criminals with maybe a 4th or 5th grade education. And then they went about predating on and then systematically dehumanizing the young male population, adolescents and young teenagers, who they forced families to give to them so they could dehumanize them and build them into their terrorist organizations. They would make them, for example, holders of the legs of people they were beheading, for example, as they beheaded them in the mosques. They took over anything that would really be an institution you would rely on for healthcare, for example, like the hospital, and turned it into a terrorist site in which they would kill people. And in one case, took a 13-year-old boy, killed him, packed his body with explosives, dumped him in a traffic circle in the city of Talafar, waited for his father to reclaim the body, and then remotely detonated him. I tell you this story not to offend anybody, but just to let you know what kind of an evil had sort of fallen on this city. It was one of these places, and I saw others in Baghdad, where, when I did have hair on the back of my neck, you could feel it stand up. I mean, you could feel the evil was palpable in these places. So this is an area where faith had to play a very important role for us. I was very adamant that our soldiers not in any way think that they should match brutality with brutality. We had to transcend that brutality. We had to recognize that the citizens in this city were the victims of these people, and we had to clarify our intentions with our deeds. And we had to isolate the enemy emotionally, psychologically from an enemy that was preying on them. I met with the sheikhs. I talked with the sheikhs about our common humanity, and talked with them about that we all want better lives for our children and what was in common between us. And then we conducted a major operation in the city. But just in the category of things I can't explain, when I'd first gone to Iraq in 2003, I left a fellowship here at the Hoover Institution, and I got to Iraq, and I was General Abizaid's executive officer, who was the commander of Central Command. And he told me, he said, you're the worst XO I've ever had. And I said, sir, it reflects poorly on your judgment that you gave me the job. Because you knew I didn't have the fawning nature to be a good XO, But he was a fantastic boss. I learned a lot. But one of the first people I met when I first got to Iraq in May of 2003 was a man named Haider al-Abadi. Haider al-Abadi was a parliamentarian, and he was at the back of the line to get a badge before a really critical security meeting. And so I helped him out because I had met him, brought him to the front of the line. We had the recalcitrant warrant officer who didn't want to give him a badge. I said, hey, Chief, make it light on yourself, brother. Give this guy a badge right now. So that was our first time we got to know each other. We stayed in contact. And then when we got the mission to move to Talafar, I consulted with him again because he was very plugged in up there. He wasn't from there, but he knew the dynamics in the region. And when I got to Talafar, I noticed that there was a cycle of sectarian violence. I believe what drives that kind of brutality is really ignorance. Ignorance is used to foment hatred, and hatred is used to justify violence against innocents. And so we knew we really had to break that cycle. But people can fall into that cycle of violence, right? And so the Shia community, which was beleaguered, and were the victims of al-Qaeda, the principal victims, everybody was a victim of al-Qaeda in the city, were in this rump neighborhood in the southwest part of the city. And they also occupied with a police force a 16th century Ottoman castle in the middle of the city. The police force, though, had morphed into a death squad. And they would venture out at night and kill as many Sunni Turkmen men as they could, because those were the neighborhoods controlled by al-Qaeda. Of course, this helps al-Qaeda portray itself as patrons and protectors of those people, and it was just driving the cycle of violence. So I knew that we had to break that cycle at first thing. And the police chief had to go. This guy, his name was Colonel Ismail. And I knew it would be tough to get rid of him, but I called Haider al-Abadi, and I said, hey, Haider, this guy, I know he had 9 members of his family killed by al-Qaeda, so he was driven by vengeance. I need your help. He got him out of that, got him out of the police job, and then a fantastic human being, again, I think Providence, comes into the job, a guy named Najm Abed Abdullah al-Jabori. My interpreter, who accompanied me to my first meeting with this replacement police chief, his name was Uncle. He was from Detroit, Michigan. He had been with me on the first operation during which we lost our first soldier, a member of my security detail. And he'd been very seriously wounded and refused evacuation because he was the only person who was there who could speak Arabic. But he was about 60 years old, and which is young now, I guess. But I mean, back then, I thought, man, that guy's old. So I only kept him with me when we were in a very secure kind of area. And so he looks at Najm, and he said, Police Chief Najm, who then later became the mayor, he said, who was your teacher of English literature? He asked him in Arabic, at Baghdad College, which was the most prestigious kind of high school in Baghdad. And he looks at him and he says, you were. So, and this, again, one of these things that are impossible to explain is that my interpreter was the teacher of this new police chief, who who turns out to be an extraordinarily human being and humanitarian, who helped bring the city together to heal the wounds of the city after a very successful operation to destroy Al-Qaeda, separate them from the population, and restore life back to the city. What I'd like to do is read you a letter that I think from Mayor Najm to us, parts of a letter, that indicate the role that faith plays, especially when you're confronting the kind of evil that we confronted. And he wrote this in Arabic. It was later translated and given to our regiment. To the courageous men and women of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment who have changed the city of Tel Afar from a ghost town in which terrorists spread death and destruction to a secure city flourishing with life. To the lion hearts who liberated our city from the grasp of terrorists who were beheading men, women, and children in the streets for many months. To those who spread smiles on the faces of our children and gave us restored hope through their personal sacrifice and brave fighting, and gave new life to the city after hopelessness darkened our days and stole our confidence in our ability to reestablish our city. I'll skip ahead here. I've met many soldiers of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. They are not only courageous men and women, but avenging angels sent by the God himself to fight the evil of terrorism. He went on to write, God bless this brave regiment. God bless the families who dedicated these brave men and women. From the bottom of our hearts, we thank the families. They have given us something we will never forget. To the families of those who have given their holy blood for our land, we all bow to you in reverence and to the souls of your loved ones. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They are not dead, but alive, and their souls hovering around us every second of every minute. They will never be forgotten for giving their precious lives. We see them in the smile of every child and in every flower growing in this land. Let America, their families, and the world be proud of their sacrifice for humanity and life. So faith plays an important role in confronting evil. It also plays an important role in grieving those who are lost. Our faith that God has a special place for our warriors who fight in the name of humanity and have that kind of an effect on the innocents who had been subjected to so much suffering and horror in Tel Afar. I'll tell you one other quick story about Haider al-Abadi. Okay, it just so happens when I become National Security Advisor, he's now the Prime Minister of Iraq. And as I was serving a president who was deeply skeptical about any kind of sustained commitment in Iraq, we organized conversations between the two of them that convinced President Trump that it was important to stay in Iraq and in Syria long enough to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, which was the kind of subsequent organization that took over the mantle of the evil organization Al-Qaeda. So I would say that faith plays an important role in preparing soldiers for combat, ensuring their ethical conduct in combat, and grieving losses, and helping soldiers connect the risks that they take and the sacrifices they make to an achievement of some aim that is worthy of those risks and sacrifices. And then finally, I'll tell you just a quick story about Afghanistan. I went to Afghanistan in 2010 to form and lead a counter-corruption and organized crime task force. General Tony Zinni, who's a great Catholic, and Katie actually invited him over to our house for dinner with the Archbishop of Richmond, which he blames me for because now he has to make considerable donations every year to the diocese. But General Zinni called me and he said, hey, congratulations on commanding the anti-gravity task force, in Afghanistan. But when I got to Afghanistan, to understand how these corrupt networks worked, I knew I had to build a lot of relationships with the Afghan people and those in the know. And so I wore civilian clothes, went out to dinners, met people, and I got invited during my first week to go to the installment of a new governor of Herat province in the far west of the country. Against probably all regulations, I traveled in civilian clothes without even a weapon and flew on an airline that was later condemned because it was falsifying maintenance records, but made it. Again, Providence, right? Providence. And landed in Herat to this big festival, huge festival for the new governor. I was the only American in this place. It was strange and fun. And so after the governor was installed, we went to an old warlord's hunting lodge on the top of a mountain, and I got to sit next to the governor and then who knew there's a huge after-party scene in Afghanistan, right? And I'll tell you, I mean, there's nothing that Afghans are more proud of than their alcohol. I mean, because it's forbidden, you know? So, I mean, everybody, so as soon we went to this first house, and all of these people who were hosting the after parties had been Mujahideen era, you know, militia leaders or you know, Mujahideen era fighters against the Soviet occupation. And one of these houses it was for a man named General Azimi, Muhammad Azimi, who had later become the spokesperson for their Ministry of Defense and so forth. Very welcoming host, and of course, you know, got all the alcohol out, and people are sitting together, and I sat next to his right in the position of honor, and we're sitting like a rectangle, and there's a gentleman next to me, and I engaged him in conversation. I just read a really fascinating book, which I recommend to all of you, called The Sewing Circles of Herat, and it's about an Afghan who lived in Herat who was very concerned about women not being educated. So he formed a literature study group for women, and he had lookouts outside. So when the Taliban were coming down, this is during the Taliban period, during 96 to 2001, they would alert him, and they would get out the sewing machines and act like they were just sewing. So I'm telling this gentleman the story. I just read this great story. You won't believe it about the sewing. And the guy looks at me and he said, yeah, that was me. That was me. It's the only time I ever told that story, right? Ever told that story. And I told it to the person, you know, who ran that sewing circle. And when I got back to Kabul, I looked up in the book, his pictures in the book. So incredible story there. But I got to know General Azimi, and I got to know his son actually very well, Sohab as well. And I talked to his son a lot. I gave him some advice about where to go to officer candidate training and so forth. And then the next time I saw his son's name was in the New York Times. I think it was July of 2021. His son was leading a special forces team that, unlike many other Afghan units, had accommodated with the Taliban as they were making the gains in the countryside. And they fought to the last man and were completely wiped out. His son was killed. General Azimi was now a fugitive, essentially, from the Taliban, and was in Kabul, trying to get out of Kabul. What we did, our research team at the Hoover Institution, used our research assistants under the direction of a fantastic person, Chelsea Berkey. Chelsea, would you stand up just 1 second? Yeah, you have to stand up. Under Chelsea. And we ran almost a 24-hour operation to help get people out of the country who had helped Americans and were beleaguered and in danger. So, you know, we had, you know, 19, 20-year-old students on WhatsApp. And one of them received a message, you know, on WhatsApp, said, hey, don't worry about my brother anymore. He was drug out of the house and shot in the head today. And this was someone who was a professor in the American University of Afghanistan. So I never thought that I'd have to apply, you know, grief work and stress management to students at Stanford, having retired from the Army. But you know, we took solace in the fact that we got a lot of people out, helped a lot of people. We were part of an enterprise, really, trying to help people get out. But General Azimi, who I'd met all those years before, we did get him out. He wound up in Canada. We worked with a new Michigan Senator, Alyssa Slotkin, on that case, and now he's settled in Canada. I think he's in Canada. He went from Albania then to Canada. But what I wanted to share with you is that, you know, I think it's important to keep your faith and to believe in providence, and if you do the right thing, inspired by really what Jesus, what God would expect us to do, that these sort of threads run through your life, you know, and there are these connections that you could never really imagine happening, whether it's the parliamentarian you meet becoming the prime minister, or this guy Najim, you know, being the perfect person to help heal a place that was torn apart by terrorism, or in this case, General Azimi and the affection I had for him and his son, and then being able to do something for him under the most desperate conditions years later. And so all of this, you know, you would think that confronting evil would weaken your faith, that confronting evil would raise doubts about humanity and make you fundamentally pessimistic or maybe even disconnected from your faith. But I'll tell you, every time I encountered these kind of challenges and confronted the kind of evils that I saw, it strengthened my faith because I've seen good overcome that evil. And whereas our faith is apparent, I think, in extremis, I think that we have to also try to pass these stories on to others. I've never really talked about this, by the way, and I want to thank Peter for connecting me to all of you. But it's given me an opportunity to reflect on my own faith and how that my faith has been important to me on these kind of missions in combat. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you. I want to thank you again for those of you who have answered a vocation and are going to serve all of us. You're true heroes, and it is wonderful to be in your presence. And finally, I'd just like to say, we have been through, a lot in our society and in our own country. I don't think as much as, some of the places that I was with our troopers overseas. But, we've had a number of blows delivered to us over the years, right? We've had, I think going back to 9/11, if you start with the 2000s, the most devastating terrorist attack in history. We did have the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had a financial crisis, that left a lot of Americans behind, as well as big transitions in the global economy, especially associated with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, the loss of a lot of manufacturing jobs, in the middle of the country. Hey, toss in on top of that an opioid epidemic. How about social media and the degree to which the business model for social media companies rests on getting more and more advertising dollars through more and more clicks, and to get those clicks through showing people more and more extreme content and various, conspiracy theories. Think about then COVID-19, the pandemic, the degree to which George Floyd's murder and the violent aftermath seem to polarize us even further, the vitriolic nature of our partisan political discourse these days, doubts about denial about elections and so forth, and still, I think the vitriolic nature of politics as we see another transition of presidential leadership. So I think that could make all of us kind of pessimistic. We can get caught up in it, but I do think that your role, all of your role, and the seminarians who are going to minister to us, it's always important, right? But I think it's so important today because all of these traumas, I think, have us, even though we're more connected to one another than ever electronically, we seem to be more disconnected from one another than ever, emotionally, psychologically, and in terms of faith and ethically, morally, spiritually. And so I think all of us have a role in doing that, and reflecting on kind of the warrior ethos and the cohesion of military teams that over time, take on the quality of a family, and where the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. I think that kind of sense of community is missing, and I think the church is the best place, the most important place to help restore that sense of community. So thank you for all that you do, what the diocese does. Your Excellency, thank you for everything that you do and your leadership. And what a pleasure it is for Katie and I to be with you. And I look forward to hearing what's on your minds and where you'd like to take the conversation. Thank you.
General, that was a powerful talk. When you were in Afghanistan and when the Americans withdrew, there were many Afghans who became refugees. They were helpers, they were translators, and so on. They're still refugees, and many of them are seeking entry to the U.S., and we've been very slow in processing these people. They're still out there. They're still in refugee camps. What do you see that our government can do to help the Afghans who helped us?
Right. Hey, well, thanks for that question. The one thing they can do is Congress can pass a bill that's pending right now. I can get the name of it. I can't remember it right now to everybody. But Chelsea, if you have it, I think it's the one that Ry Barcott was trying to get, we were working on and writing letters to senators about. But what happened is, it was a disaster, obviously, in August of 2021. I think it's really going to be a long time before we can rub out that kind of stain of that period of time. What we did, I think, in Afghanistan is really unconscionable. If we were going to leave, why didn't we just leave, right? So the Trump administration began to negotiate with the Taliban in 2019. Heck, even the Obama administration, when it completely left Iraq in 2010, 2011, they didn't negotiate with Al-Qaeda in Iraq when they were leaving. What the hell were we doing talking to these people? And then what happened is because we were talking to the Taliban without the Afghan government present, that delivered psychological blows to the Afghan government. Then we gave them the timeline for a withdrawal. We stopped supporting them with all the intelligence and air support that they had really depended on. And the writing was on the wall, right? And the Taliban just went around and said to people, hey, when I tell you to accommodate with me, you've got a choice. You can either accommodate with me or we kill you and all your family. You know, what is it going to be? And so in many ways, we partnered with the Taliban, really, against the Afghan government at the end. It was crazy to me. And then the other thing that happened, as you alluded to, is when does it ever make sense to evacuate the military before civilians? That's what we did. And so it was a ready-made hostage situation there from the very beginning. And so we're recovering from that. I think the Biden administration did an extremely poor job in dealing with the crisis that they precipitated. Instead of getting all hands on deck in the State Department, you know, they asked for volunteers to work on the authorization for travel and the various visas, you know, the special immigrant visa and the P1 and P2 special visas for Afghans. And so it was a complete catastrophe. Still, there hasn't been any accounting for it, but that's kind of beside the point. The question is, what do you do now? Some people in Congress are pointing to very few Afghans who came under false pretenses and turned out to be terrorist threats and have been apprehended. If the process that is called for in this bill is put into place, that vetting would have demonstrably caught them, right? Because what happened is you had the worst of both worlds. You had an inadequate screening capability, and then also, you know, the inadequate capacity to absorb people into the whole process. So, you know, I think that passing that bill is the one thing we could do, and maybe ask, you know, if you've got friends, or just write to your congressman or senator to say, please pass it. Do you know what the name of it is? The Afghan Adjustment Act is what it's called.
Hello, General McMaster. Thank you for your service to this country and for your amazing speech. That was the most awesome talks I've ever heard as a Christian. And I have one or two questions. First is, there's been many rumors of wars escalating throughout the world, such as in Ukraine, the Middle East, potentially an invasion in Taiwan. How do you think a potential World War III could pan out, and what can we as Americans do to prepare, God forbid, if it were to escalate to a global conflict?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. I really do, and I'm not saying this to be engage in hyperbole, but I do think that we're on the cusp of a world war. I mean, I think you can make the argument that a world war is already happening, right? You have really an axis of aggressors these days, which are two revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, who are determined to tear down the existing international order and replace it with a new order that's sympathetic to their authoritarian form of governance, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. They have brought into this axis Iran and North Korea. Each of them have different objectives, but they share that common kind of overall purpose. And they're now actively aiding and abetting each other in very material and obvious ways. So obviously in Ukraine, you have Iran providing Shahed drones and missiles to the Russians. You have China providing the hardware and equipment necessary to sustain Russia's war-making machine and feeding Putin's ATM with the purchase of Russian energy. And now you have North Korea, which has provided about 8 million artillery rounds to the Russians, and now I think what will be ultimately tens of thousands of troops fighting on European soil in the first major war in Europe since World War II. That conflict, I believe, is connected and has cascaded into the Middle East. And I think Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, who was a theocratic dictator in Tehran, decided that the weakness we were portraying, based on a hard time sustaining support for Ukraine, was a good reason to activate what they call the Ring of Fire strategy around Israel. And I believe that the intent of October 7th was to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews, to be the opening battle there. I think Hamas may have jumped the gun timeline-wise, but what the Israeli Defense Forces are uncovering in southern Lebanon are very detailed war plans for the infiltration and physical attack into northern Israel by Hezbollah, as well as the marshaling of a proxy army of about 40,000, an Iranian proxy army in Syria. And you've seen kind of the massive weapons that have been interdicted in the West Bank. So the Ring of Fire was meant to be a forefront war on Israel's border to kill all the Jews. I mean, really, that's what they wanted to do. And I believe that what those conflicts had in common was the perception of weakness, that you can draw a straight line between the debacle in Iraq in August of 2021 and the reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. It was right in that summer of 21 when Russia marshaled on the borders, and I believe that the perception of weakness essentially green-lighted that invasion. Everything we did to allay Putin's security concerns seemed to him like a green light, right? And so what did we do? We listed all the things we wouldn't do to support Ukraine. We suspended lethal assistance to Ukraine. We pulled our ships out of the Black Sea. We evacuated our embassy and scuttled our embassy and offered Zelensky a ride out, you know? So, and then what we've done since then is we provided this really halting support for the Ukrainians. Tanks or no tanks, fighters or no fighters, how many? Do they have authority to use those weapons across the border or not? I mean, it's all been meager in terms of the support. The numbers sound big, but you know, that money's not being sent to Ukraine, as you hear some people say. That money is being spent in the United States for weapons that are then being provided to the Ukrainians. So I think that perception of weakness and sustained support for Ukraine then also encouraged the Iranians and their proxy forces. You know, that war is cascaded across the region, of course, interrupting shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb, as well as you know, an intensification of attacks against U.S. facilities and positions and personnel in Iraq and in Syria as well. So what's next? I think what's next is a looming crisis in the Indo-Pacific region. China is getting much more aggressive in terms of not only what China's saying, but I believe that Xi Jinping is preparing the Chinese people for war. You can see it in his speeches. You can see it in what he's done to develop the cross-strait invasion capabilities and also the capabilities to project power to claim the ocean in the South China Sea. You know, just in recent months, Chinese vessels have conducted 7 acts of war against a treaty ally of the United States in the Philippines. They have violated Japanese airspace with their military aircraft for the first time ever in the past month. And they've committed a soft blockade against Taiwan. And they're also, as I mentioned, you know, they're building up the forces not only for this, but also they're building up a strategic nuclear capability that is a 400% increase in what they have now. And what they've done from a cyber perspective recently by getting in all of our telecom, infrastructure and so forth, is I believe that they're preparing to black us out from a communications perspective as the first blow in what could be a first strike nuclear attack. Okay, you're going to think, okay, that guy's crazy. But I'm telling you, as I read what they're doing, I think that's a very plausible explanation. That doesn't mean they're going to do it, but it means they've been given orders to prepare all these tiers of capabilities, right, against us, to keep us at bay at least, while they can have their way with Taiwan and with Japan, and to create an exclusionary area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific. If that is an echo of familiarity, it sounds like the Greater East Asia Code Prosperity Sphere that Imperial Japan pursued in 1941 by doing what? Delivering a blow to Pearl Harbor and then conducting a centripetal offensive to take over the same region that now China covets and believes is their right to dominate. So what do we do about it? I believe that, you know, and one of my biggest kind of philosophical and theological heroes is G.K. Chesterton, you know, who said that war is not the best way of settling differences, but it's the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. Or what George Washington said, which is, he said, the most effectual way of preventing war is to be prepared to fight one. And, and so I think we have to take on 3 initiatives as a matter of urgency. The first is to build up our hard power. Nobody's afraid of aggressive diplomacy. Nobody's afraid of the threat of sanctions. Nobody's afraid of declassifying information that somebody's about to invade somebody. These were all the things the Biden administration did, which were fine, but proved inadequate to prevent Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Hard power matters, demonstrating to your potential enemies that they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. The second is we have to reduce our dependency of our economy as supply chains in our economy on single points of failure controlled by China. We have to reverse the atrophy in our industrial base and improve the resilience of our supply chains. China has coercive power over our economy that is not unlike the coercive power that the Gulf states had over our economy in the area of energy in the 1970s. And that's just not a good idea, as Germany recently demonstrated with its dependence on natural gas associated with Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. And then finally, I think we have to take advantage of the great potential we have in the areas I've already mentioned in terms of supply chain and industrial base, but also to unleash our energy potential and to take away from some of these authoritarian adversaries some of the coercive power they have in energy, to use U.S. LNG exports, for example, liquefied natural gas, to get people off of coal, to reduce carbon emissions, to drive the price down, and maybe even tax it if we can drive the price down, and pay down our debt and become more financially viable as a country as a result. So I think all of that would demonstrate strength. And I think really that's what prevents war, is strength. What is provocative is the perception of weakness. And I think as soon as we realize that, the better. But you still hear people on both ends of the political spectrum, you know? I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's J.D. Vance or Ben Rhodes, right, talking about Ukraine. I mean, this is not a partisan problem. But people keep talking about allaying Putin's security concerns. It doesn't matter. I mean, that's not going to work with him. That's what's provocative. Putin has aspirations and goals in mind that go far beyond anything that's in relation to what we do. He wants to reestablish the Russian Empire. Xi Jinping wants to take center stage in the world, wants exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific. Iran really wants to kick us out of the Middle East as step A, to step B, which is to establish hegemonic influence across the region and destroy Israel. That's what they really want to do. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner that we, along with allies and strategic partners internationally, can get after the hard work of deterring conflict and preventing these cascading conflicts from cascading further. So thanks for the question. I mean, we have agency over it, right? It's not inevitable, but I think we're on a very dangerous path right now.
Thank you, General, for coming tonight and for your very inspiring talk. I'm Father Gary Thomas. I'm the Director of First Year Formation here at the seminary. You spent a lot of time tonight talking about your faith and also like a lot of the evils that you have encountered both in war firsthand as well as the evils that exist in the world that you just made serious allusions to with the last question was just asked. I served as exorcist for my diocese for 15 years in San Jose. The question I have is this. You talk about, when you talked about faith and talked about evil and providing religious services for your troops, in the last 12 years, Satanism has been introduced into the military. And I've had military chaplains from a number of the branches personally contact me and ask me what to do when they have to share space on their military bases with people who are satanic priests or involved in Satanism some other way. And I've read a lot of articles online in the last number of years as well, both Catholic websites as well as other websites, about the introduction of ministering to people who claim to be satanic and are going to serve alongside the rest of the military, where we are a Judeo-Christian country, or we used to be at least. And in light of that, how can, if you can help me understand, how can the military reconcile allowing satanic priests and other people who very much clearly align themselves with personified evil, which our church has taken a very strong stand against, in light of trying to have a military that is both prepared and ready to combat evil that may not be of a personified nature, but whose root is clearly personified.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a terrible situation that you're outlining. I mean, I was aware vaguely, the various kind of Wiccan, chaplains and so forth that you would hear about. I never saw one, never met one. But I really, I think that what we have to do is do this through the U.S. Congress and do it through our political leaders who we elect in the positions of leadership. One of the things that we're up against, obviously, is the anti-establishment cause of the Constitution. And if these satanic groups, mask themselves, portray themselves as some kind of naturalist religion, which I think is what they do, is they come in under the cloak of that, rather than brazen Satanism. But I think that what we can do, I think what the military can do, is marginalize it. I think leaders can talk about our faith in ways that are sort of, multi-denominational, multi-faith, grounded in, Stoic philosophy if necessary, to counter that kind of, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a theology, anti-theology, I guess. I don't know. I think what concerns me quite a bit, really this really began in earnest under the Obama administration, and then in the Biden administration, is an effort to kind of change the military culture. Our culture our military culture is based on Judeo-Christian ethics, because our country is also based on that. Our Constitution is based on Judeo-Christian ethics. And there are some people who have come into government, really in the Democratic Party, almost exclusively, and I don't mean this as a partisan. I got fired by President Trump, remember. I also got fired by President Biden, okay? President Biden fired me from the West Point Board of Visitors, so just bolstering my bipartisan credentials, So, they're pushing an agenda to change the military culture. I think a lot of it is because they don't understand the warrior ethos. They've never served in uniform and probably didn't know anybody who has served in uniform. And they have this idea because I think the political institutions with which they're associated are not held in as high esteem. I think that had something to do with it. They wanted to knock the military down a few pegs. I really felt that way with a lot of their policies. And also because they fundamentally misunderstand the warrior ethos and what binds soldiers together, is what they've tried to do is advance what I would call an extreme, DEI orthodoxy, for example. And the way I would distinguish extreme from, DEI would be that it's really based on equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. Because in the military, you discriminate, right? I mean, you want people who have a sense of honor, who are willing to self-sacrifice. In the infantry, you need some man, a man or a woman, it doesn't matter to me, who can carry 80 pounds across 14 kilometers in mountainous terrain, I mean, to accomplish the tasks that you need for that team to be combat effective. And then also what they've been pushing quite a bit is sort of the, various elements of identity politics, or various postmodernist theories. And they've been valorizing victimhood, essentially, which I think has affected our society in ways where we've robbed young people of agency. And in the military, you have to believe in your agency, right? Or you're not going to fight. So I think that a lot of what has been pushed in those administrations, I was part of it with actually Mike Waltz, who is now the nominee for National Security Advisor, or will be appointed as National Security Advisor. Doesn't require Senate confirmation. It was called the National Independent Panel for Military Readiness. And in that, it was an effort to make the bipartisan point, stop politicizing the military. So if your political agenda includes something that's kind of an anti-Judeo-Christian agenda, these are the people who are from the civilians in the Department of Defense are going to advocate for an embrace of I don't even know what to call it, Father. I don't know what to call it, Gosh, I'm open for other ideas. I mean, I had not really thought hard about this, about the effect on the chaplaincy, the effect on soldiers, of people, bringing this kind of, again, I don't want to call it, evil ideology. Yeah. Well, I think, soldiers don't make policy, generals don't make policy, right? Elected leaders make policy. So I think the key thing is to elect people who won't allow it to happen, because they're the only ones, the civilian leaders in the Department of Defense, the President, the Secretary of Defense, they're the ones who are going to have to act against it. The military can't do it. This is why I think this idea of having kind of a tribunal or whatever for so-called woke officers, which is ridiculous, okay? I mean, I just got to tell you, the military leaders are not woke and they're not extremist, right? So you hear, the extremes on both parties. Like the far left says, oh, they're extremists. The far right says they're woke. They're neither one of them. And if you don't like the policies, don't blame the generals or admirals. I'm not saying that because I'm, a general, I don't want to get blamed, okay? But if it's a policy issue, it's the civilians who make the policy. And you wouldn't want generals to make policy, right? Because nobody elects them, right? They're not accountable to the American people. So thanks, Father. Thanks.
Thank you very much, General, for being amongst us for your talk. Thank you also to Peter Robinson for facilitating this evening's lecture. Thank you very much, Peter. We'd now like to invite you over to the refectory for a reception. General McMaster will join us, and so you may have a question or comment to run by him. Please join us in the refectory. The seminarians will help point the way out the doors to the left and over to the refectory. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.